right, so I presume everyone here knows a good bit about Father Kapaun, but I also think it's a fairly good bet that maybe you haven't heard this particular story in the detail that I'm going to tell it in. Okay, and so the story that I tell is actually by Mr. Mike Dowe, who's a West Point graduate. He graduated in June 1st of 1950. So let me give you just a little quick historical summary so I can place this in the right context, because sometimes our history is a little fuzzy, right? World War II started with the invasion of Poland, September of 1939, and went until 1945. So that was World War II. The whole world was exhausted, including the United States. When the war was over, we had some forces that were left in Japan on occupation duty. Father Kapaun had served in World War II as a chaplain the last 2 years of the war. Came back home, and his bishop welcomed him back home, and really it looked like he had plans to kind of groom him to become the superintendent of Catholic schools. He sent him to Catholic University to get his degree in education, came back to the diocese. He loved it here in the diocese for every good reason, but he really did have he had developed an attachment and a love for the soldiers that he was serving. And so he wrote his bishop a few times, and very humbly and very obediently said, I'm completely at your disposal, but the call deep inside of me is to go back and serve the soldiers. So his bishop allowed him. He returned to Japan, came back on active duty, was in Japan, and then the Korean War is about to start. So Russia had already become communist Russia. North Korea became communist North Korea in 1948. China went through its great awakening. There's that word, awakening, woke. The Great Awakening in 1949, China became communist China. And then in 1950 is when the North Koreans invaded South Korea. So if my hand was China and my thumb was the Korean Peninsula, and this is not to scale, just for the record. Okay. If my hand is China, there's a peninsula that sticks out the southern end of it. That's the Korean Peninsula. And Japan is over here. Korea points right into the center of Japan. The peninsula had divided in half along the 38th parallel on the globe. So that's basically the border between North and South Korea. North Korea invaded South Korea lightning fast. And the invasion was so swift and unexpected, and we were unprepared for it, that the North Koreans pushed all the way through the entire southern peninsula, and the only piece of South Korea that was not conquered by the North Koreans was this ancient city down on the edge of the peninsula called Busan, and about a 30 to 40 mile radius outside of Busan. That was called the Busan Perimeter. Right, so it was a desperate situation that the South Koreans and the United Nations were in. The United Nations responded to assist the South Koreans, but it was a very bad situation. All right. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been, during World War II, his main theater of operation was the Pacific, and he did the island hopping with soldiers and Marines through the Pacific, moving back up toward Japan. He was an expert at amphibious landings, and so we had this idea of a major thrust that rather than just trying to fight our way out through the forces, he did an amphibious landing, which came around and landed at Incheon, which is right up at the 30th parallel, and landed a whole bunch of United Nations forces. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's a shallow bay. The tides are very tricky. It would have been impossible for almost anybody, but he had spent the last 3-4 years of his career doing that. So it was the right man at the right time, which often makes the difference, to be available, to be skilled and available and ready when you're called. So we landed forces in Incheon, and so now the North Koreans had the enemy behind them. So that's called a turning movement. The enemy now has to turn and deal with the people behind them. So they started running north now, and now the UN forces, with the United States as a spearhead, we are now pushing the North Koreans back up north. And we pushed them past the 38th parallel, and now we are invading into North Korea. As that was happening, the Chinese communists said, if you cross the North Korean border, we will enter the war. And we said, oh, you will not. We didn't believe them. So we had pushed the North Koreans as far north as they had pushed the South Koreans south. And in very late October, we had forces up there. And basically, just the way the North Koreans had thought they had won the war, now we were thinking, okay, the war's over, we've won. It's going to be over soon. So we had people up north in late October in the mountains in their summer clothes. We didn't bother to ship them their winter clothes, because we said they won't need it. They're going to be home in just a week or two. But the Chinese communists had invaded through the mountains of North Korea and were now in the mountains around all these American units that did not know they were there. When I start telling the story, there's going to be the night of the battle of Father Kapaun that he was involved in, for which he received the Medal of Honor. There were about 60 to 80,000 Chinese communist forces hidden in the mountains, so we ended up being outnumbered about 4 or 5 to 1. So Mike Dowe had graduated on June 1st, 1950. He's a lieutenant, 22 years old. Graduates on June 1st, he goes on graduation vacation. And he's on vacation. The North Koreans invade South Korea on June 25th, 1950. All the people that had just graduated from West Point were getting calls from the Army, report back to your first place of training, your first duty station. So all these guys that were on vacation are now running back to their bases, and they're being told, you are going over to Japan and Korea right away. Now, when you graduate from the academies, you are not quite fully trained to go in and do your lieutenant's jobs. There's still several months of training that you're expected to have. These guys did not get that. And they were sent overseas, and Mike Dowe, at the age of 22, lands in Korea with a platoon that's already been in combat for several weeks, and introduces himself, and he says he thinks he has to make a good impression on his new soldiers. He says, well, men, I'm honored to be here, and I'm glad I can be your platoon leader. I hope I can serve you well. And one of the guys said, well, sir, we hope you last longer than the last 3 lieutenants. They were each killed within a week. That was their welcome to him, right? Mike Dowe was an infantry platoon leader. He served for a month and a half or so. He was eventually captured on November 4th, so just a few days after Father Kapaun's unit was captured. So Mike Dowe, the author of the article that I'm going to read, met Father Kapaun while in captivity, and they became good personal friends. And so when Mike was finally released from captivity almost 3 years later, one of the first things he did is he went to the Saturday Evening Post and told the story and had somebody help him write this story. Mike has done all sorts of things for our country. He was one of the founders of our nation's nuclear program. He's a nuclear physicist. He's still working on that kind of stuff today at age 97. He's got a beautiful family, kids, grandkids. He says, after my family, the most important thing I've done for this country is write this article. That's Mike Dowe's thought about getting the story of Father Kapaun out to people. So that's what I'm going to share with you, okay? Good. The Ordeal of Chaplain Kapaun, told by Lieutenant Mike Dowe, Jr., through Harold H. Martin of the Saturday Evening Post. He wore the cross of the chaplain branch instead of the crossed rifles of the infantry, but he was, I think, the best foot soldier I ever knew. And he was the bravest man and the kindest. His name was Emil Joseph Kapaun, and he was a priest of the Roman Catholic Church. But the men he served in the prison camps didn't care whether he was Catholic or Baptist, Lutheran or Presbyterian. To all of them, Catholic, Presbyterian, and Jew alike, and to men who professed no formal faith at all, he was always simply Father. And each of them, when trouble came, drew courage and hope and strength from him. He's dead now, murdered by the Red Chinese, and his body lies in an unmarked grave somewhere along the Yalu River. But the hundreds of men who knew and loved him have not forgotten him. And I write this so that the folks back home can know what kind of man he was and what he did for us and how he died. Now, the first thing I want to make clear is this. He was a priest of the church, and he was a man of great piety. But there was nothing soft or ethereal about him, nothing holier than thou. He wore his piety in his heart. Outwardly, he was all GI, tough of body, rough of speech sometimes, full of the wry humor of the combat soldier. In a camp where men had to steal or starve, he was the most accomplished food thief of them all. And in a prison whose inmates hated their communist captors with a bone-deep hatred, he was also the most unbending enemy of communism. And when they tried to brainwash him, he had the courage to tell them to their faces that they lied. He always spoke in phrases that even the most unlettered soldier could understand, because he himself was the son of a Kansas farmer, and he had a farmer's flair for down-to-earth, homely talk. In his religious services, which he doggedly held despite the threats of the Chinese communists, his sermons were brief but deep, and every point he made struck home. Even the great mysteries of the Christian faith, which no one can really understand, still, they became clearer to us whenever he talked about them. He always spoke in parallels, relating the sufferings that Christ endured to those that we were forced to bear. And as he spoke, the agony in the garden, the road to Calvary, the crucifixion, all became very real to us, who ourselves lived daily under the threat of death, and who bore our own crosses of blows and cold and illness and starvation. But Christ endured, he told us, and so we too must endure. For the day of our resurrection from the tomb of this prison camp will surely come as surely as a stone was rolled away from the sepulcher. And because of these sermons, which gave us hope and courage, and because of the food and the medicine that he stole for us, and because of the care that he gave us when we were sick, many of us came back who never would have survived our long ordeal without him. He had become a legend among the troops long before the Chinese had captured him. He was known to always ride to the sound of the guns. And he had a chaplain assistant that drove him around in his Jeep, but one time the Jeep had been blown up and his chaplain assistant had been wounded. So he commandeered a ramshackle bicycle, and he would ride that thing all over the roads of Korea with his pockets full of grain and some corn and peaches that he'd scrounged from Korean orchards. He would ride down the bumpy roads until he came to a fighting position, and he found somebody in a fighting position, and he'd stop and he'd drop into the hole with them and say, "Hi, I'm Father Kapaun. What's your name?" "Noah, it's good to meet you. You want an apple? Here, take an apple." You know what's worse than finding a worm in your apple, Noah? Finding half a worm in your apple. Okay, you want to pray? Let's pray. God, I just pray for Noah that you would give him a good life and keep him safe for the rest of his life. Amen. And then he'd be up, moving on. It's just it's wax. You don't want that. Okay. Then he'd be up, moving on to the next hole, fighting, looking for the next position. He was always known to stay close to the fighting. And even when the fighting had stopped on a dusty slope after the cav had taken a hill, he'd set up his altar on a litter stretched across 2 ammunition boxes. And there on the battlefield, with mortar fire still coming in and the enemy massing for a counterattack in sight, he'd hear confessions and celebrate the Mass and administer Holy Communion to men who, in another hour, would be in battle again. His parish was the front lines and the aid station right behind those front lines. There, he'd cheer and comfort the men as best he could. He'd joke and kid with the lightly wounded, and over dying men, whatever their faith, he'd say the last prayers of the church. He seemed to have no fear that he himself might be killed. In fact, once at Kumchan, early in the war, when word came back that there was a wounded man in a position so exposed that the littermen could not reach him, Father grabbed a lieutenant buddy of his from another unit, and they went after this officer and brought him back, crawling and ducking from rock to rock through fire so thick that his pipe was shot out of his mouth. And for that particular action, he received the Bronze Star with V for Valor device. And I do want you to consider this. He went out to rescue a man who was wounded with his pipe in his mouth. That is dedication to pipe smoking. It was his devotion to the wounded which finally cost him his freedom and his life. It was at Unsan on the 2nd of November in 1950. For 36 hours, the 8th Cavalry had fought back a fanatical attack. Early in the morning, a breakthrough came, and all day, hand-to-hand fighting swirled around the command post and in the aid station where wounded were being treated. Finally, at dusk, the order came for every man who could still walk to try to break out to the south and get back to friendly lines. Father was unwounded and could and should have escaped, but he refused to go. Of his own free will, he stayed on, helping Captain Clarence L. Anderson, the regimental surgeon, take care of the wounded. And there, just at dark, the Chinese took him as he said the last prayers over a dying man. I'll never forget the first time that I met him. It was at Pyeongtaek on a backwater of the Yalu River, a village where prisoners from many American units were being assembled. With the survivors of my unit, Charlie Company of the 19th Infantry of 24th Division, I had been brought there from near Anju, where we had been overrun. The men of the 8th Cav, who had broken out of the perimeter and had later been captured by 2s and 3s as they scattered to the south, were already there. As we came in, they crowded around us asking for word of Father Kapaun, but we had none. One night, they brought us down to where the wounded from another group lay along a road on litters made out of straw sacks stretched across rough pine poles. And I was on the right-hand pole at the front. And we carried them on our shoulders, and as the shoulder began to ache with the pressure of the pole against the muscle, we'd stop and change positions. It was during one of these breaks that I noticed the man who was carrying behind me. He was a short man, thick-shouldered, wide-set gray eyes, a strong jaw, and a deep cleft in it, and he wore a little thin red-brown beard with a little tuft of goat whiskers at the chin. "I'm Mike Dowe," I said. "Kapaun," he said, putting out his hand. "Father," I said, feeling as if I'd met a long-lost friend. "I've heard about you." And he lowered his voice and smiled and said, well, my bishop doesn't know I'm here, so don't tell anyone, because if he finds out, he'll be pissed. So that was my first taste of Father's humor, which would cheer us all so often in the coming months. Hour after hour, we stumbled on. Now, it was hard enough to walk by yourself on that dark and slippery footing, but carrying a man on a litter was agony. The enemy told us from the moment we were captured, you are no longer soldiers, you are now prisoners. You don't listen to your officers, sergeants, you listen to us. You leave these men here and you march north. And sadly, some of our men, in the fear of being captured or in the confusion of it all, actually listened to the Chinese. And whenever one of our soldiers was left behind, they were certain to freeze to death. But much more commonly, as we marched away, a Chinese guard would stay back with the wounded soldier. And as we got over a hill or around a bend in the road, we would hear shots, and we knew that another one of our soldiers had been executed. Some of our officers and NCOs tried to order men to carry, but that never worked. Father never ordered. At the end of the break, he would simply say, all right, boys, let's pick them up. And all down the row, men would bend and lift and carry his example. Because in the 60 to 80 miles that we were forced marched north, I never once saw Father take a break. The next morning, they came around and pulled all the officers out and put us together in a compound at the north end of the valley. Father squawked about being separated from his enlisted men, but the Chinese just poked them with the butts of their guns and made him move along. In the first week of our stay in the valley, the Chinese allowed us a food ration of 500 grams of millet, or cracked corn, per man, per day. It was a starvation ration to begin with, and then they realized they couldn't give us that much, so they cut it back to 450 grams. It was obvious, Father told us, that we must either steal food or starve. And so, in that dangerous enterprise, we must have the help of some power beyond ourselves. And so, standing before us all, he said a prayer to St. Dismas, the good thief who was crucified at the right hand of Christ on the cross, asking for Dismas's aid. I will never doubt the power of prayer again, because it seemed Father could not fail. At the risk of being shot by the guards, he'd sneak at night into the little fields around the compound and prowl through the shocked corn and find where the Koreans had hidden potatoes and grain beneath the corn shocks. He moved out of the crowded room where 19 of us slept spoon fashion in a desperate attempt to use our own body heat to keep ourselves alive in the freezing cold nights overnight. He moved out of that, though, into a smaller crib out in the middle of the field because he found that crib backed up to a crib full of Korean corn, which he surreptitiously stole for us ear by ear. His riskiest thefts were carried out by daylight, right under the noses of the Chinese guards. The POWs cooked our own food, which was drawn from an open supply shed some 2 miles down the valley. When men were called out to make the ration run, Father would always slip in at the end of the line. And before the ration detail reached the supply shed, he'd slide off into the bushes. And creeping and crawling, he'd come up behind the shed, and while the rest of us started a commotion amongst ourselves or with the Chinese guards, Father would run into the supply shed, snatch up a sack of cracked corn, and scurry off back into the bushes. There were other men stealing too, and some of them squirreled their stolen food away to eat by themselves. But Father always took his booty and threw it into the common pot. Father never directly confronted the men who were hoarding food, but at night, after a successful foray, he'd say a prayer of thanks to God for providing us food which we can all equally share, which seemed to shame the men who were hoarding, and soon the private hoarding stopped. His one great failure had overtones of humor which would serve to relieve at that moment what was a dark tragedy. A little black pig had wandered into the compound, and men who had tasted no meat in months felt themselves drooling as Father, a big rock in hand, cautiously stalked the little pig. And while dozens of silent prayers went up from all the corners of the camp, Father raised the stone and he brought it down. It struck the pig, but it was only a glancing blow, and the pig set up a horrible squealing, running down the road. A Chinese guard came running out of the guard shed, slamming a magazine to his rifle, saying, "Huh, huh?" Father fled for the latrine, and the little black pig went wee, wee, wee all the way home. Soon after that, our wounded in the sick house, and only the Chinese had the temerity to call it a hospital, our wounded began to die by the dozens, poisoned by their untended wounds. Finally, the Chinese allowed Doc Anderson to go to their aid, although at that point he had nothing left but the skill of his hands. Still, encouraged by the permission, Father asked permission to go along. His permission was refused. What these men need is medicine, not prayers, the Chinese communist told him. He said, well, since they aren't getting any medicine, a little prayer's not going to hurt them. And they said, no, you will not be permitted to spread your poisonous Christian propaganda here. And so began Father's most hazardous exploits. On days when there was a ration run, he'd stop and steal food at the warehouse. And then, with his pockets stuffed full of cracked corn and millet, dodging the Chinese roving patrols that watched the trail and would have shot him for being outside of his barracks and off limits, he'd move on to the houses where the wounded were. On days when there was no ration run, he would just sneak there, down the creek, going down the creek that ran through the valley, ducking under the bushes to keep out of the sight of the guards along the road. He would scrounge cotton undershirts and cut them up and turned them into bandages. And he took men's old bandages, foul with filth and corruption and sickness, snuck them down to the river, washed them, dried them, and snuck them back again. He picked lice from men's bodies, an invaluable service because men who were too weak to pick their own lice could be bled to death by the insects within 3 days. He let them smoke his pipe, loaded with dry cotton leaves, and he joked with them, and he said prayers with them, and he held them in his arms like babies as delirium came upon them. But the main thing that he did for them was to put into their hearts the will to live. Because when you are wounded and sick and starving, it's easy to give up and quietly die. Somehow, as it says in the first letter of John, power went forth from him and healed them. In Father Kapaun's valley, the conditions were the same as the camp known as Death Valley. Actually, they were not the same. In Father Kapaun's valley, there were about 200 men that resisted the attempts of the Chinese communists. And because they were resistors, they were guarded by a battalion of North Korean soldiers. They received less food, practically no medical care, worse living conditions, worse clothing, and harsher treatment. In Death Valley, there were a few thousand prisoners who largely cooperated with the demands of their captors. They were guarded by one company of North Korean soldiers. They received more food, medical treatment, better conditions, and they died at 10 times the rate that the people in Father Kapaun's valley died. But even when men died, he did not abandon them. POWs had to bury their own dead, carrying the bodies of the adjacent mountainside and later, in Pyeongtaek, across the frozen Yalu River to a little island where we dug graves in the icy frozen ground. Men dodged burial detail whenever they could, but Father always volunteered. And at the grave, as the earth covered the naked body, and the bodies were always naked because he would save the clothing of the dead to warm the bodies of the living, he would utter for them the last great plea of the church, eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. When he had done all that he could at the houses of the wounded, he would slip into the houses where the enlisted men were kept, and he would step in quickly and quietly saying, "The Lord be with you." And the starving, torpid men lying on their straw mats would sit up and respond as he had taught them, "And with thy spirit." And then he would say a quick general service, beginning with a prayer for the men who had died in Korea, both in battle and in prison. And he'd pray for the sick and wounded, and for the folks back home. And then he would say a prayer of thanks to God for the favors that he had granted us, whether we knew about them or not, for the food and the wood and water that we've received, even at the hands of our enemies. And then he'd speak very briefly a short, simple sermon, urging the men to hold on and not lose hope of freedom. And above all, he urged them not to fall for the lying doctrines that the communists were trying to pound into our heads. "Be not afraid of them who kill the body," he'd say, quoting from the scriptures. "No, fear ye him who, after he hath killed, hath power to cast into hell." Because to Father's stubborn faith, a man who bought the communist teachings, and a very small group did, either out of ignorance or opportunism, that man was selling his immortal soul. In his soiled and ragged fatigues, with his scraggly beard and a queer woolen cap made out of the sleeve of an old GI sweater pulled down over his ears, he looked like any other half-starved prisoner. But there was something in his voice and bearing that was different. Dignity, composure, serenity. These things radiated from him like light. Wherever he stood was holy ground, and the spirit within him, a spirit of reverence and abiding faith, went out to the silent, listening men and gave them hope and courage and a sense of peace. His very presence somehow could transform a stinking, louse-ridden mud hut into a cathedral for just a little time. He did thousands of little things to keep us going. He gathered and washed the foul undergarments of the dead and distributed them to men so weak from dysentery that they could not move. And he washed and tended these men as if they were his own children. He traded his watch for a blanket. He explained to the camp commander that it was a good watch. It was also important to him because it was a gift that his mother had given him on the day of his ordination. The camp commander took the opportunity to mock Father Kapaun. "Oh, how much you must love your dear mother to part so easily with such a precious gift. Here, take the blanket. Much good may it do you." Father Kapaun took the abuse, but he also took the blanket, and he cut the blanket up, and he turned it into dozens of pairs of socks for men whose feet were freezing. With nothing more than a sharp stick in his bare hands, he cut steps into the steep, ice-covered path that led down to the river, because men in their weakened condition from starvation, even a bruise could become a deadly condition for them. And the most dreaded housekeeping chore of all was cleaning the latrines, and men argued bitterly over whose turn it was to carry out that loathsome detail, considering that everyone had explosive dysentery. And while men argued amongst themselves, Father would just sneak out the back door and do the job himself. In mid-January, in sub-zero cold, Father led out scrounging parties to prowl through the ruins to find nails and tin and broken boards, to patch the houses that we were forced to live in, to make them at least somewhat livable. In the yard of the officer's compound, he built a little fireplace with bricks which he had stolen from buildings, and on it, with wood that he had stolen. In fact, once they caught him stealing pickets of wood from the prison fence, and for that crime, they made him stand outside overnight, practically naked, hoping that the exposure would kill him. With that wood, he would start a fire, and he would heat water in pans made from tin that he'd stolen and pound it into shape with a rock. And every morning, he'd bring in this pan full of hot water, and calling cheerfully, "Coffee, everybody," he'd pour a little bit of hot water into each man's cup. And though there was no coffee in it, still, somehow that sip of hot water in the morning gave each man heart to rise and pick off his lice and choke down his bowl of soupy millet and face, if not with cheerfulness, then at least without despair, another day of captivity and abuse. He was always telling us that we'd soon be free. And he was always dreaming up fancy menus, 10-course meals we'd eat when we got home, kolachki and everything else that was good. Everybody described their mom's cooking, but he was the best at it. At night, we'd hear the roar and see the flash of great explosions to the south. Those were our bombers working over the supply roads and bridges of the communists' supply routes. But we thought it was our artillery. He'd say, "The guns are closer tonight, boys. Hear them? See how the moon is full? But the next time the moon is full, we'll be free." Well, as weeks and months passed, robbed of all strength by pellagra and beriberi, men grew weaker. The unbroken diet of millet and corn became nauseating. We could barely choke it down. By mid-March, we were in such desperate condition that we were boiling weeds, just trying to get some vitamins into our diet. The hideous swelling of the body that is one of the first signs of approaching death by starvation was showing up on more and more of us. As our bodies weakened, the communists stepped up the pace of their propaganda assault upon our minds. Hour after hour, we had to sit in lectures while Comrade Sun, a fanatic little Chinese communist who hated Americans with an insane hatred, railed against our rotten, capitalistic Wall Street civilization. And then we'd have to get up and comment upon the great truths revealed to us by Comrade Sun. A few men, in bold and reckless despair, commented in unprintable words exactly what they thought of the great truths revealed to us. Those men were thrown into a freezing hole or subjected to other tortures, sometimes resulting in their death. Other men would veil their ridicule. Well, according to the great doctrines revealed to us by Lenin and Stalin and Abbott and Costello, and then they'd make fun of the article. Father was never openly arrogant, nor did he use subterfuge. Without ever losing his temper or raising his voice, he'd answer the lecturer, point by point, with a calm logic that would set Comrade's son screaming and leaping on the platform like an angry ape, a show which we always enjoyed watching. Strangely, they never punished him, except by threats and ominous warnings. Now, 2 officers who knew him well, they were taken away and tortured. With their hands tied behind their backs, they were lifted by ropes until their wrist joints pulled apart. They were then taken down into a different building and forced to write out accusations against Father. And then they brought him back in to publicly accuse him. They charged him with slandering the Chinese, which was true, if you consider telling the truth about the communist slander, which they did. They said that he advocated resistance to the communist study program and that he displayed a hostile attitude toward his captors, all of which was also true. They said that he threatened men with court-martial if they went along with the communist Chinese, which was not true. Father never threatened anybody. In fact, when the 2 men came back to our barracks after their ordeal, unsure of their welcome by the rest of us, Father made the point of being the one to greet them at the door, and looking at their twisted, rope-burnt hands, he said, "You never should have suffered 1 minute trying to protect me." Well, we expected at that point that the public accusation would bring on a farcical kangaroo trial in which Father would be convicted and taken out and never returned. Instead, they merely called him in and bullied him. And we realized then something that we'd half known all along. They were afraid of him. They feared him because they recognized in him something they could not break, a spirit they couldn't get their hands on. And above all things, they knew that if Father was maltreated, the whole camp of 4,000 men would mutiny. And so, on Easter Sunday, 1951, he hurled at them his boldest challenge, openly flouting their law against religious services. In the yard of a burnt-out church in the officers' compound, just at sunrise, he read the Easter service. All his mass equipment had been lost at the time, and all he had left was the things he used when administering the last rites to the dying. The purple ribbon, called a stole, which he wore around his neck as a badge of his priesthood. The gold ciborium, now empty, but in which he had once carried the host, the bread of life, and administered Holy Communion. And a little prayer book that he borrowed from another soldier. And he fashioned a cross out of 2 rough pieces of wood. And from a borrowed missal, he read the Stations of the Cross to the scarecrow men sitting on the rubbled steps of the burnt-out church. He told them the stories of Christ's suffering and death, and then, holding in his hands a rosary made from bent barbed wire cut from the prison fence, he recited the glorious mysteries of Christ risen from the tomb and descended into heaven. As we watched him, it became clear to us that Father himself at last had begun to fail in his strength. On the starvation diet that we were allowed, a man could not afford to miss a single day's meal without growing too weak to walk. And for months, Father had been sharing his own meager rations with sick and dying men. The week after Easter, he began to limp, hobbling along on a crooked stick. And the next Sunday, as he read the service for the first Sunday after Easter, as he reached the line in the epistle, "And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith," his voice faltered, and we caught him as he fell. Beneath his tattered uniform, his right leg was dreadfully swollen and discolored. For weeks, we knew that he had been suffering terrible bone aches, a byproduct of hunger that came upon men at night with such force that men would scream and beat the ground in agony. Father, when awake, never even whimpered, although tears of pain were often in his eyes. But when he slept, like the rest of us, his iron will broke, and he would moan pitifully. Finally, the bad pain went away, but the leg continued to swell until it was one great mass of purple, blue, and yellow flesh. The communist doctor, a brainwasher posing as a medicine man, pronounced the usual diagnosis by which they tried to convince us that we truly were an evil, decaying, and decadent race. "Father," he said, "has syphilis." Well, Doc Anderson and his colleague, Dr. Eisenstein, knew it for what it was. It was a blood clot blocking circulation in his leg. And so, using the blocks from the fire pit that Father had built for us, in which he boiled water to purify water, which helped get rid of our dysentery, we would heat those bricks up, and we would apply them as hot packs to Father's leg. And after a couple of weeks, the swelling went away and got better. He got up, although he was still weak, walking around on his feet, and then a fearful dysentery seized him. And as he had so often done for us, we cared for him as best we could. And he beat that, and he got on his feet again. And then one raw, cold day, he arose, a walking ghost practically, to give the last sacrament to a dying man. And the next day, his eyes were bright with fever, and his breath came in a hoarse rattle. He had taken pneumonia, and soon was in delirium. And thinking back upon it, I believe that that period of semi-consciousness was the only happy time that he knew during his captivity. Around him, there seemed to gather all the people he had known in his boyhood, on the farm in Kansas and in his school days. Babbling happily, sometimes laughing, he spoke to his father and his mother, and to the priest that he had known in seminary. Even in his delirium, his unbreakable spirit manifested itself in sallies of humor. Finally, fearfully, he sank into a deep and quiet sleep. But the next day, he awoke. He was completely rational. The crisis had passed. He was getting well. But the Chinese did not intend that he should live. He was sitting up, eating with an appetite and cracking jokes when the guards came with a litter to take him to the hospital. And we knew then that he was doomed, because the hospital was not a hospital at all. It was a death house too dreadful to describe. In the room in which men were placed in their last extremes, they were left to lie untended in filth and feces and freezing cold until death mercifully took them. Our doctors protested violently against his being taken, but the Chinese cursed them and forbade them to go along and help. The rest of us protested, but all they answered was, "No, he goes, he goes." Father, fearing that we would get hurt, protecting him, begged us to stop. Father himself made no protest. He looked around the room at all of us standing there, and he smiled. He held in his hands the ciborium, the little covered cup in which long ago he had carried the bread of life. And he said, "Tell them back home that I died a happy death." And he smiled again. And as they loaded him on the litter, he turned to Lieutenant Nardella, from whose missal he had read the service. And putting the missal in Ralph's hands, he said, "You keep holding the prayers, Ralph. You know them. Don't let them make you stop." And then he turned to a guy, another officer, who before his capture had been having troubles back home. And he said, "When you get back to New Jersey, you get that marriage of yours straightened out, or I'll come down from heaven and kick you in the butt." And then he turned to me, and he said, "Don't take it hard, Mike. I'm going where I've always wanted to go. And when I get there, I'll pray for all of you." Well, despite Father's directives, I stood there crying, unashamed, as they took him down the road, the little gold cup still shining in his hand. And beside me stood Fezi Gurgen, a Turkish lieutenant, a Muslim, who said, "To Allah, who is my God, I will pray for him." And a few days later, he was dead. Our guys were the ones that had to carry him up the hill to the death house under the supervision of Chinese guards. And they told us that as he was being carried up, he prayed, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." When they carried him up, there was 3 buildings on the top of the hill. There was a sick coal shed on the bottom, 3 buildings on the top. One was just for the Chinese medical cadre. Another building was if you're going to receive any treatment beyond the no treatment that you got on the bottom. But then there was a third building, 10 meters by 10 meters, just a building of concrete blocks, no windows. That was the death house. As they brought him into the death house, Comrade's son was standing at the door to gloat over his victory. And as they carried him in, Father reached out and grabbed his arm and asked Comrade's son's forgiveness for the harsh things that he had thought about him during his captivity. A few days later, the little daughter of the Chinese camp commander was walking outside the fence, tossing up and down something that glittered in the sun. Father's little gold cup. And on the demands of the prisoners of war, it was returned to us at Operation Big Switch, the prisoner exchange at the end of the war. And we brought it back to commemorate Father's deeds and the deeds of all who died at the hands of the communists. It is to be placed in a memorial in his hometown, which it was, and then it was brought down to Kapaun High School, which it was, and I think right now it's on display in our nation's capital at the Medal of Honor Museum. I think I just learned that yesterday. A year later, on the anniversary of Father's death, Ralph Nardella asked the communists for permission to hold a service in Father's memory. that permission was refused. And you know what? I'm glad. I'm glad it was refused, because it told me that even though he was dead, his body lost forever in a mass grave, they were still afraid of him. They feared him because he was the living sign of something they knew they could not kill, the unconquerable spirit of a free man, trusting in his country, but owing his final allegiance only to his God, the God who sets men free. And so if you are a friend of Christ and burn with his love, people will be drawn to your light and they will bask in your warmth. But should the day come that you no longer burn with love, countless will die of the cold. So thank you, God, for letting Mike Dowe survive that living hell to be able to bring us this particular story. And thank you for the life of Father Kapaun, son of Kansas, and the light and warmth that he was in the dark cold of that communist camp. Jesus, when you were hungry, he shared his own food, and then he found more for you. When you were thirsty, he boiled water, and he made it clean for you. When you were homeless, he scrounged among ruins and patched up houses and made them livable for you. When you were naked, he saved the clothes of the dead, and he made socks out of blankets for your freezing feet. When you were sick, he made and cleaned bandages for you, and he stole medicine for you, and he comforted you in his arms. When you were imprisoned, he welcomed you and visited you and cheered you. And when you were dead, he buried you. Jesus, he blessed his persecutors, and he prayed for his enemies as you had taught him. He confronted, contested, and conquered demons. He was all man, all priest. So, Lord Jesus, in the midst of the folly of war, your servant and friend, Chaplain Father Emil Kapaun, spent himself in total service to you on the battlefields and in the prison camps of Korea until his death at the hands of his captors. We now ask you, Lord Jesus, if it be your will, to make known to all the world, by miracles and signs of peace, the holiness of Chaplain Kapaun and the glory of his complete gift of self for you. For you are the source of peace and the strength of our service to others and our final hope. And we ask all these things in your name. Amen. Father Kapaun, pray for us.